Hey, folks, welcome to our sauna. Our sauna is the way that was supposed to sound.
We don't even have any water this time.
No, we
Hey,
don't
Zach,
have
you
any
want to
water.
get Toby to get us some water?
It's a desert out there and in here. That's pretty much where we are.
Sorry, we're late. A little late, guys. We've got a weird system, so to see the chat, we have to look above you, which is really weird and sort of hard on the neck, but we're going to make this work this time.
Text large enough.
Yeah, I could see it just fine. It's just not in a great place. And you now have the controls you need?
I have the controls.
Once again, our producer is going to be off in charge of the rocketry team. We have, however, deputized Fairfax. He is now literally the deputy producer, so he often sits in Zach's chair when Zach isn't here, and if something goes haywire, we have him to blame.
Yes, I think haywire is about the most we can expect from the animal.
Yes, haywire.
Yeah.
Yes, galaxy brain though he has.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here we are, our 10th one of these, private Q&A. And we are going to start, we're going to do some COVID questions from you, some more explicitly evolutionary questions, animals, talk about trans some, and then try to get into a few of the sort of more one-off questions that didn't fit into a category.
I would just point out that I am being attacked for my my couture.
Really?
Yes.
What did you
do
now?
Is it a laundry day for me? I think what I did is I wore a less formal
It's Al.
shirt.
It's Al. Al always attacks you.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Al.
Well, I don't know. He just
get a grip. I mean, I don't know. It's where we are. This is I
It's all in good fun.
Yeah.
I think is this right, Al? Are you the one who asked Zach to be wearing a bolo tie yesterday? I think so. Yeah. So
you think it was Al?
I do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Comment noted. I will.
I like this shirt on you very much, as I said.
That's why I'm wearing.
Yeah.
In fact,
You should probably stand up and strut around a bit.
No, I think that's
I know you're not going to.
About to happen.
No, it's not. Okay. See, Nick here says that Al is jealous of those broad shoulders. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. I'm getting compliments on the scarves.
Thanks, Nick.
Scarves.
I don't know how to pluralize scarf.
No.
Scarfs, I would say.
Scarves. Okay,
Scarves.
I hear ice coming our way. Toby, you're allowed to be on screen. You could just walk behind and everyone would be thrilled. No. My water has arrived through the invisible Toby. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
Okay. So because I always prioritize the evolution and animal behavior questions, I thought we'd get at least one set of questions in before that, because they're just the evolution and animal behavior questions, the ones I find the most interesting. But literally 4 of the 6 questions that came in, I think we've already covered. And so I went back and figured out where. So you haven't seen any of these, but I'm going to read all of them. But the first 2, I think we need to spend just a little bit of time with. But then the next 4, I basically am going to point you guys to where you can find us already having talked about it.
Cool.
Okay. First question today is, can COVID vaccines help long haulers with symptoms? And I saw, and I don't think we ended up talking about it on a live stream. I saw an article, not a peer-reviewed article, like New York Times maybe, that made this claim. And I can't make sense of how this could possibly be the case.
Well, I mean, I think, unfortunately, this is the other side of you're interfering with a complex system.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got a complex system. It's now had a novel input, the coronavirus, and now you're going to add another novel input.
Mm-hmm.
Could that novel input disrupt whatever is going on? So if the COVID virus, let's say that the story that we understand about COVID is correct and that the body clears COVID, but some people keep having symptoms, which could be the result of damaged tissue. It could be the result of a miscalibration, don't know. But something about that system. Let's say that long COVID is autoimmune in nature.
Yep.
And then you dump a vaccine on it that causes production of the spike protein, which then occupies the antibodies and T cells that are targeted at COVID, detaining them from screwing up the body through autoimmunity.
So is there any reason to think, though, that the spike protein that would be produced by these vaccines, RNA or DNA, would jump to the head of the line In terms of occupying the immune system?
No,
as
but
opposed to just like, so it's like a density dependence argument.
right. If your body is producing antibodies and T cells that are attacking
Yeah.
tissues that are not infected,
Mhm.
then dumping something that occupies some of those T cells that waste their time,
Yeah.
right, could be positive. So I'm not saying that I think this is true. And part of the problem is, I'm starting to see discussion, and I think it is important that we have it about what fraction of long COVID is long COVID and what fraction of long COVID is something else. I don't want to call it hypochondria, but people are tuned.
So what if it might not exactly be long COVID and it might not exactly be hypochondria? What kinds of things are you imagining?
Well,
or have you heard?
Let's put it this
glimmers
way.
of discussion of.
Everybody is involved in some novel way of living now, right? I know that I periodically wake up and I feel, oh goodness, that feels like I might be getting sick. And I start wondering about COVID. And then I figure out that it's not COVID and I get over it. How many times does that happen before I ever heard of COVID? And
so like misattribution, even perhaps, like, okay, complexity, a suite of symptoms. I know I had the thing. This suite of symptoms broadly matches this description, and we have a name for this. And if I name it this, then I have credibility. It doesn't have to be any kind of there doesn't have to be intentionality. There doesn't have to be deviousness.
Oh, right.
In any way.
Absolutely. The point is, it's a complex system, and
it's a relief to have a name for a thing when you didn't, and if you've got an easy name to default to, perhaps that's what you do.
Let's put it this way: you've got some large number of people who have long COVID.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's say long COVID is absolutely real, and some fraction of them just simply have it.
Yeah.
Okay. And some fraction of them have got some new pathology that just is coincident in time with them having had COVID.
Yeah.
Or was COVID pushed something that was in the offing into an active form, and it's just a casual connection that really has very little to do with COVID. Or we've also heard very credible stories of latent pathologies that reemerge due to COVID, such as mononucleosis.
Yeah.
So anyway, there are a lot of things tied up in here.
Yeah.
And I guess
Holly Math Nerd says long COVID is incentivized on social media, major attention, political point scoring for Team Blue.
Yeah. Right. And so you would imagine that some fraction of long COVID is clearly not long COVID, right? What fraction is it? And how do you sort between that which is truly new and mysterious and that which isn't?
Yeah.
And the answer is nobody knows. We're doing a terrible job with COVID itself with respect to what it actually does, what it responds to.
Yep. No, and I do think, this is sort of where we were, and what I see up here, both from Holly and other people, is that we've now got a culture that raises people in the estimation of unfortunately many social groups, if they say they are weak, if they say they are sick or victims, or still dealing with something that they just need help with, and this is unfortunately this to the degree that this is identifiable on average by political party, it's more a Democratic position, and to the degree that it's identifiable by sex on average, it's more of a female position. And I don't like that either of those things are true, but they are. And we have a move to basically celebrate that sort of thinking, as opposed to self-sufficiency and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and try to figure it out and try to make yourself better and be anti-fragile. And, all of those things that I just said, will help not just, yes, all of us, if more people did that, but also every single individual who does.
No question. It also, and this goes to your point about this being more on the blue side than the red side.
Yeah.
But in some sense, the Marxist instincts that exist over on the left build in a reward for neediness. Yeah. And so in some sense, this is being manifest in a medical context. And what we have is some kind of Munchausen thing. And it is very important not to say, oh, there's a lot of fakery around this. Some of it's unintentional, therefore it's not a thing. And the problem, the real victims are the ones who do have something and it's getting lost in a cloud of noise. I mean,
frankly, that's exactly what we see with trans.
Yeah.
Right. And so we'll get there. I really do want to get to those questions, although sort of mid-20s in my list here. That, just because all the noisy people and the vast majority of, in the case of long haul COVID, I don't know, but it may be that the vast majority of people who are getting all the attention are not experiencing a thing related to COVID, and there's still a real thing. And at this point in, you said it's not culture wars, it's about existential threat, but, I'll say culture wars for the moment. I feel very much that way with regard to trans. We know it's a real thing.
Yeah.
There are real trans people. Yeah, as we said many, many times, but the thing getting all the airtime is largely not that.
Yeah, in that case, there is at least a natural distinction. It's not a hard boundary, but there's a distinction between trans and trans activism.
Yep.
And that the problem is when the two things are synonyms, there's long COVID and long COVID, what do you do? Right. I do think there was a period before long COVID was famous, and I was watching the long COVID subreddit. And so these were people who were having trouble getting the attention of the medical community, and very few in the outside world had even heard of it yet.
Yeah.
And so my sense is most of that was quite real.
And I feel this way actually about a lot of the autoimmune diseases, like for instance, fibromyalgia, right? Like if I didn't happen to know someone who did their PhD dissertation on fibromyalgia, there is a very good chance that I would still feel like, whatever, this is some, it's an attention-getting, thing that is really hard to pinpoint, that has a whole set of symptoms that you don't have to have almost any of them to be diagnosed, and it's mostly women, as a lot of these autoimmune diseases are. And so, is that physiological or is that personality? But no, as it turns out, there's a ton of reality to, modernity creating autoimmune disorders, and that happens to be one of them.
And it may be that women are more susceptible because they have a much more complex puzzle with respect to immunity and pregnancy interacting. So maybe that their immune systems are tuned in a way that predisposes towards autoimmunity. I would say, though, in some sense, the fault, or a large part of it, is with the medical community, which does not properly distinguish between, we have the distinction between a pathology and a syndrome, right? And the problem is, guess what? It's a complex system. What's a syndrome? It's something with a bunch of overlapping symptoms. But you get that anytime you have a cascade of 20 things that happen in a row, anything that intervenes at one of these stages causes all of the pathologies downstream of it. So is fibromyalgia a thing, or is it four things, right? That
and this is true for
separated.
Sorry, this is true for so many things that are, for instance, the DSM, like schizophrenia, multiple things, autism, probably multiple things, and some of those things aren't real things.
Yeah.
Right. Like the thing we've named includes all of this, and there are maybe 5 distinct etiologies, including that's not a thing. Like what you've got isn't even part of this thing that we're trying to describe.
Right. And in fact, we need, because every single time you have a pathology, some fraction of the people who say they have it are there for psychological reasons rather than physiological reasons.
Yeah.
Basically, that does not discredit the physical phenomenon at all. It's just, it comes with the territory.
Right.
And so we ought to have that category. And, I don't like hypochondria as that category because that suggests a kind of global phenomenon. But basically, there is a human analog to what we call placebo. And someday we're going to have to talk about placebo because it's a very interesting and not what people think kind of topic. But the point is, just as a phony drug can fool you into reporting that you're better, a person can falsely understand themselves to be ill, right? And that's just simply inherent in the territory. And anytime you're dealing with syndrome stuff, it's going to get all tangled.
Right. All right. Cool. Let's move. Second question, also on COVID-ish. Given the fact that Fukushima led to thousands of lawsuits against TEPCO and the Japanese government, do you think avoiding legal and financial responsibility is what's ultimately behind the lack of a proper Wuhan investigation by the WHO, CCP, and US authorities who could be liable through NIH funding? Or do you think the global COVID damages would be so incalculable and uncollectible that other factors are more likely motivators for the lack of transparency?
It's a really good question.
I
And
know.
I think, the answer, I frankly don't know how likely judgments are or where they would happen, right? Are we talking about US courts and NIH and NSF, in which case they have immunities that a private entity wouldn't have?
Yeah, in the case of Fukushima, it was all one country. It was all the lawsuits were against TEPCO, as far as I know. TEPCO and the Japanese government.
I mean, just the simple way that the jet stream flows caused a whole lot of particles to land, especially in the Pacific Northwest. But
right, but the particles landing the Pacific Northwest doesn't mean that anything in the Pacific Northwest should have had a lawsuit against it.
Well, no, but obviously, okay, so we're talking about two different things. People here would have cause to sue.
Right, but lawsuits against were all against one country with the case of Fukushima, whereas this is global, and it's global in effect. But I think precisely what the question asks is, okay, if it did come out of WIV, and the CCP was, the Chinese government was helping to fund and helping to cover up, there was still involvement from the NIH because the NIH was also funding that research. And so it's at least two countries that are culpable. Worldwide effects, sure. And, at least pan-Pacific effects for Fukushima, but an isolated country for Fukushima, and really at least two countries.
It wouldn't be isolated because the reactors were GE reactors, and a lot of the reasons that Fukushima was as bad as it was had to do with known defects in those reactors.
Okay, but apparently there are no lawsuits against GE.
Okay, so I don't know anything about it, and I know very little about what international lawsuits actually look like. But I would say, superficially speaking, you could make the argument that they're hiding this because they're afraid of lawsuits. On the other hand, frankly, the thing that has me feeling like a lawsuit is the correct response is the pretense that this is natural in origin when it very likely isn't. And, my sense is every single person who has lost a family member in the later stages of this, when we should have been addressing, okay, what exactly is this virus? What is it programmed to do, and how did it get programmed to do it, right? Those people, who knows how many of them might have been saved if we had gotten honest about what we're seeing.
Yes,
and,
totally.
Again, as every time we talk about this, we have to say, we don't know that this came from the lab. But so far, if you've bet that way, the evidence keeps accumulating on your side. And if you've bet natural origin, nothing. Right? It's crickets. And frankly, crickets don't carry COVID.
Crickets don't carry COVID. And can I just say that when I referred to the WIV earlier, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which I don't know if people really call it that, but I'm sort of pleased, and I would not say this on the bigger, on the more public live streams, but that WIV and TWIV, the acronym for This Week in Virology, have those rhyming, very similar acronyms, because the 3 times now that I've attempted to listen to This Week in Virology, I have been appalled and enraged by their irresponsibility, by, either they're some combination of bumbling incompetence and like sadistic irresponsibility. It's really a nasty little podcast that's doing a tremendous amount of damage, I think.
Yeah.
Nasty big podcast.
In any case, it is, in some sense, the thing that haunts this whole story is that there is a community, an international community of virologists. And when they go stupid and then they start covering their asses, we are all in jeopardy. And the answer is, look, that's not a local to virology. We can see it in virology, and suddenly, we all know the name of the Wuhan Institute, and some of us know, the name of the podcast. But this is a general phenomenon, right? Why did Fukushima happen? Fukushima happened because the community of people who knew enough to talk about these reactors is artificially enthusiastic about them because basically they're part of an industry where, it's boom times when we are favorable to nuclear, and it's bust when we are frightened of meltdowns. And so the point is,
who was paying attention to gain of function research and serial passaging except the people who knew enough to be involved and potentially benefiting from doing it?
Right. And so I've been saying since Fukushima, right? We discovered collateralized debt obligations after 2008. Right. Had no idea we were in financial jeopardy over these things until the collapse came. And then it's like, oh, let's explain what was going on that you didn't know anything about, right? This is the danger you were in, you didn't know. We discover at Fukushima, wait, you're storing this waste where? And you're loading these things with plutonium, and what can happen, right? So it's like, it wasn't a secret. If you went looking, you could find out what was going on. But the point is, we didn't know what danger we were in until the accident happened, right? And you can say this for Aliso Canyon, which most people don't know, but this is a case where natural gas was being stored in an old oil well, basically pressurized into the earth that can spring a leak. You find it out at the Deepwater Horizon accident. Oh, wait, we're drilling how deep into deposits that are how big, and then we have to plug a leak and we can't because it's so far underwater, right? So the answer is, if you notice this pattern, right? Fukushima, Aliso Canyon, financial collapse, and maybe COVID, and there's one other I'm forgetting, then the question is, okay, what else don't we know that we're doing that is putting us in danger that we will discover on accident? That is on the accident, not by accident. But
so I'm actually going to jump forward just because you're riffing on this topic anyway to this question before we come back. What effects will modernity have on biological human evolution? Will things like medicine, resource abundance, monogamy, et cetera, meaningfully alter evolution as we know it? So just before you keep riffing, I will say I don't think monogamy belongs on that list. There's plenty of evidence that we've been mostly monogamous for a very long time. We're a lot more monogamous than our closest relatives, from which we've been evolving separately for 6 million years.
And if you put human monogamy, if you calibrate it to what monogamy looks like in other species that we consider monogamous, we're right in line, right? So the point is, if you imagine that monogamy is perfectly monogamous, then there's nary a species that pulls it off.
Right.
But if you imagine that there's monogamy with a certain amount of extra pair stuff, then monogamous human cultures look that way.
Right.
But okay, so back to the point.
Yep.
We get a series of accidents, and it is the accident itself that alerts us to the open secret of what some industry was doing that was putting us all in jeopardy, right? And so the question then is, okay, we got the pattern. What are the other dangers that other industries, what is the next accident? Can we talk about it ahead of time and talk about whether or not the thing that is being gained is worth the risk that we are taking, rather than suddenly discovering it at the point that the cat is out of the bag or the horses are out of the barn or whatever the proper analogy would be? And it's maddening to me that we are not having that discussion, right? And the fact that I was at least saying that very thing. What don't we know that we are doing where we will discover it after the cost is already being paid?
100%, you're right. And you were saying those sorts of things. You've been saying that sort of thing for decades, really. But I feel like I really began to hear you ramping that up, frankly, even before any of the other things you mentioned, but Katrina. And, it's less clear, what, Army Corps of Engineers maybe, and the seawall, but there's just a ton of these that reveal that, just as you say, reveal after the fact what we were relying on that we should never have been relying on.
Well, so these are two slightly different things. Okay. There's some industry is doing something and it has decided it is worth it, but it has a perverse incentive and will discover the downside at the point that it says, whoops, nobody imagined it could be this bad. Well, really? And then there's the other thing, which is there are lots of places where some person is knocking on doors and grabbing people by the lapels and saying, don't you understand, hundreds of thousands of people are going to die, right? Yeah. It's going to happen. And here's why, and we can stop it now. Yeah. And they're getting blank stares or they're getting fired or whatever happens. And the fact is, virtually every time we have a major disaster where some human element is playing an important role, like the Army Corps of Engineers with Katrina and the earthen dams or levees or whatever they were. Yeah. There were people who were saying, this is going to happen. It's only a matter of time. Likewise, I was surprised to discover the tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami in Indonesia. There was a
2004,
scientist who basically they had detected the problem with Indonesia was that the tsunami periodicity was too long for modern people to know that tsunamis were a big problem, unlike Japan, for example, where they're common enough that it's part of the culture, right? So there was no early warning system, but there was a geologist who had discovered that there were periodic major tsunamis, could see where people were living on the coast, and his point was,
do you know if he got specific, like, if like Banda Aceh was going to be slaughtered in
I don't know how geographically specific, but I remember it was a little bit like, that I hope I'm not fictionalizing here, but I think this is all right. There's this picture in which somebody in the Bush administration is holding a document at a meeting, some picture, just a rando picture of officials.
Bush too.
Yeah. And the document was about how planes could be used as missiles and could go after buildings.
I don't know this.
Something like this. So anyway, the point is, and then, Bush famously says, who could possibly have imagined that people would turn planes into missiles? And the answer is, well, not only did people imagine it, but there was specifically a line of logic that said this is likely to happen. Right. What are we going to do about it? And so anyway, my sense on the Banda Aceh death toll and this geologist who had spotted the pattern and was trying to raise awareness of it was that it was very similar. It's like you look at the paper and it's like, it didn't predict every detail, but it certainly predicted what happened.
Yep. All right. So let's actually finish answering that question that I inserted here.
Yeah.
What effects will modernity have on biological human evolution? Will things like medicine, resource abundance, monogamy, et cetera, meaningfully alter evolution as we know it? So at some level, this is what our book is about. And we've already talked a little bit about why I don't think monogamy belongs on here. But the hyper novelty of our situation is absolutely affecting our ability to respond. We are the most adaptable, most quickly adaptable species on the planet. And in fact, adaptability kind of is what we do. Like, it's the thing we do more than anyone else.
Totally. You and I could switch seats right now.
Yeah, we're that adaptable. Not just us, though. You too.
Yeah.
All of you.
Try it.
All y'all. Yeah, actually, try switching seats.
I think they're not in the mood. I read earlier that
they're Sarah and Al, go ahead. Oh, are they?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Then
how they arranged to get everybody watching this high as a kite together, I don't know.
Yeah, that's quite a feat of at least logistics, if not engineering as well. Yeah. But we've talked about how, like, our diet is probably affecting our head and jaw development such that now everyone needs orthodontia, or a lot of moderns need orthodontia, and that clearly wasn't the case before. And in fact, Bret did a whole conversation with Mike Mew on this last summer, maybe.
However, you've got to think about in what way evolution. So, by the way, I got taken to task on one of these where so every evolutionary biologist notices that the lack of interest in sperm banks by men is a little bit curious, because evolutionarily they should be very popular, because if you can produce children that you have no responsibility for and maybe even get paid for it, then like why are men not constantly lined up at the sperm bank? And
well, there's every now and again there will always be a story about, and the dude who thought he was anonymous got it contacted.
Well, my answer on Twitter, for better or worse, was, look, we are programmed to find enticing that which produced an increase in fitness in our historical environment, and jerking off into a cup doesn't look like any such thing. And so the point is, we're just not wired to understand that it's a bargain. And then my point, the one that got me in trouble with, I don't know, some numbskull, was if, we survived long enough and sperm banks became a significant source of offspring, we would evolve to find them. We would have evolved to...
Sperm banks are titillating.
Well, right. And actually, you'll like this. That, of course, suggests a kind of evolution of external fertilization that is rather frog-like, right? So frogs presumably enjoy, or the equivalent, whatever the equivalent of enjoyment is for frogs, externally fertilizing eggs. And so, anyway, and this is a perfectly obvious.
I mean, it could even be, you could even see it as bird-like, although there's external fertilization. The cloacal kiss is something, since they don't really have an intermittent organ.
Well, the basic answer is, yeah, it doesn't really matter what the interaction is, right? Picking up a spermatophore off the, floor of a pond.
So that's a salamander thing.
Right. So anyway, the point is, you will find fascinating and enticing that which successfully produces offspring. And given a long enough period of time, if sperm banks produce a lot of offspring, it will become this way. And somebody said, they tried to humiliate me, and they said something along the lines of, an actual evolutionary biologist actually said this, right? As if it doesn't make any sense. But the answer is, here's how it makes sense. Here's how it makes sense. There will be variation in how appealing going to the sperm bank is. In other words, some people will be more cerebral about producing offspring and more deliberate about fitness and things like that. Those people, in a world where sperm banks work, right, have a little advantage. And so the point is, whatever that thing is, wherever the information is about how to feel about it is stored, whether it is the connotations, right, and it's a cultural phenomenon, whether it's in the genes or both, will be elaborated by the fact that it keeps producing offspring. So,
well, I do think, though, that you blazed past my point, which is relevant here, which is that sperm banks would appear to appeal to that, and we haven't been consistent in our numbering strategy, and we picked one in the book, and I don't remember which one it is, but we have talked on Joe Rogan first publicly, and various places since then, of the 3 male strategies throughout history for reproduction, right? Wham bam, thank you, ma'am.
Yes. What were you about to say?
Well, I'll tell you what I was about to say. When I was like 9, my parents took me to Hawaii, and we were sitting at some outside restaurant with my brother, who would have then been 5, and I loved reading, and I was just reading the menu, and I read the sandwich, wham bam, thank you, ham, out loud, which got my parents to look at me and look at each other and go, what? Now what do we do? So now that phrase is always
it's wired to.
I now think ham. Wait, that's not right.
No, that isn't it.
No, okay. So the three male strategies are, I swear we're not high, are love them and leave them. How about I can do that one? Rape and monogamy, basically pair bonding and actually investing not just in the person you're with, but the children that you produce. And sperm banks would appear to appeal to that first strategy, right? And my point was, it may not even, and you are addressing why it actually doesn't, why we have not been selected to find, why men have not been selected to find jerking off into cups appealing. But my point is also, I think that the occasional news stories about, the dude who was the sperm bank donor turns out not to have been anonymous, and he was approached by a child, 15 years later, 20 years later, and that's never what he wanted, actually serves to confuse which strategy is this. If you really want to do this anonymously and don't want to have any relationship, don't be so certain that this is actually a reliable strategy for you. Narrative.
Yeah. I can see it, and it's a little bit like plane crashes, where the rare story that's fascinating has disproportionate real estate in our minds.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point I wanted to make, I was on a tangent here with this sperm bank stuff. My point was going to be, okay, our modern food is messing up our developmental program with respect to the shape of our jaws and the placement of our teeth.
Yeah.
Okay, but were that the story, we would adapt to our modern diet. Because we do orthodontia, we will not adapt to our modern diet. We will adapt to orthodontia. So, for example,
yes,
my catastrophe, having now had multiple teeth destroyed by my orthodontist when I was a child, my teeth are getting wrecked in my 50s because my orthodontist in my teens was overly aggressive, right? So that story then puts pressure. That is to say, you don't have enough capacity in your teeth to move them through the jaw like this and not pay a price.
Yep.
But presumably, well, actually, in my case, there's no selective consequence whatsoever, because I will have implants that replace those teeth. So anyway, you've got to figure out at the point you discover some sort of harm or change, you have to figure out what its impact will be on, for genetic evolution, you have to figure out what its impact will be on babies produced and longevity and success of those babies, right? To the extent that modernity, by creating lots of food, takes pressure off the acuity of your eyes, right? You might imagine one effect. To the extent that eyes that do not have proper acuity are corrected with lenses, you would expect a different effect. And so the answer is 100% modernity is going to tremendously affect people. In part, it affects them less effectively than you would guess because we are changing so quickly that even a strong evolutionary signal may not last long enough to have a real consequence. And so anyway, you have to get involved in the style of logic, and I'll always ask whether the pattern you're seeing has a consequence for production of or success of offspring.
Yep.
And that tells you in which direction we will evolve. But at a genetic level, this is going to take a long time, and change is so rapid that my sense is basically we're getting a lot of noise and not much signal.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't know how to pronounce mwahaha, as I think it.
I think you did it exactly right.
Says, I never needed braces. I think I was the only kid in the entire school. I had the same experience. I think no one else who didn't have braces at some point, but it varied a lot in terms of some kids were in braces as early as like 5th grade, and some kids, still in college, frankly. And I have wondered actually. So my brother, who was adopted by my parents as a 1-day-old baby, so does not share my genes by common descent, but people often said, "Oh, your brother and sister, you look like each other." So we share enough sort of lineage far enough back. He's not of a totally different ethnicity. My brother also didn't have braces. And it's not for lack of care. That makes me wonder what was going on in our household.
Different food.
Right. Like my father, as he used to call himself a little old country programmer, grew up on a farm in Iowa, but then became a computer scientist. My mother, excellent cook, and my father cooked occasionally, but I have this sense, although I don't exactly remember it, that we were being told to eat real raw food a fair amount of the time as snacks, things like carrots and hard fruits and such.
The occasional fence post.
Just gnaw on it when you're hungry, kids. Sure. Yeah. But I mean, it's entirely an anecdote, but the fact that 2 kids who don't have a genetic relatedness, who grew up in the same family in an era when almost everyone had braces and neither of us did, has struck me as strange.
That's a great point, actually. Yeah. And in some sense, this is part of the key. So Mike Mew, whose position is obviously reasonable. I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, he is just so much righter than the field.
He's a right-wing misogynist, right?
No, I didn't detect that. He seemed like a pretty sweet guy. But
after your conversation with him, the New York Times did a hit piece on him and his dad.
Yeah.
And I mean, we were going to talk about it, and it just got buried underneath, but really insane hit piece. And it was like, some of his fans are hateful.
Right.
Oh my God, this again. Yes. Anyway.
But in any case, his point is it doesn't make any sense that a massive need for braces would be genetic. It's too fast. Right. This is obviously a developmental phenomenon, which I would agree, it is obviously a developmental phenomenon. Mm-hmm. But a household like yours is actually, to the extent that there are households that do something different and don't need orthodontia.
Yeah, and actually, my dad from an early age instilled in me a love for steak cooked rare.
Yeah.
That's something that my dad, for both my brother and me also. So that's also a chewing thing, like a mastication thing that, rather than fence posts, might have been more common in my experience.
Probably. Yes. Although a fence post cooked rare is not a bad.
No, especially if you're a termite.
Especially if you're a termite. Well played.
Thank you. I interrupted you.
No, it was worth it. I enjoyed that. So, yes. So the point is, we typically look for identical twins raised apart.
Right.
Right. But actually, non-siblings raised as siblings,
non-genetic siblings raised as siblings,
is a good test for
from the very as early as possible, except for the gestational environment.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, at this point, I almost expect and his mama is ugly at the end of these hit pieces. Yeah, exactly. Very much so.
Right.
But they may even have done something like that because it's, Mike Mew is following the footsteps of his father. And I think they do actually even slide in some like phenotypic attacks against his dad, maybe. He's like an old guy, right? Yeah. Anyway, it was appalling.
Man, dentists, they're vicious. It's why they go into the business in the first place, right? It gives them cover to create pain.
So because I have been some combination of lucky and the environment I was in, I never had orthodontia, I never had a cavity, I've had almost no dental intervention in any way, and so I do not have this hatred of dentists that I totally understand why you have. I did for a brief spell have a dentist who kept convincing me that he was finding cavities. He's like, see it? I'm like, nope, I don't see it. And I took it to a different dentist. He's like, you don't have any cavities. I'm like, oh my God. So I hate the profit motives and the perverse incentives, but you're just slandering all dentists because they've been bad to you.
Which I shouldn't do, because actually, in some ways, we have a very hard time finding good people in a lot of industries. And actually in Portland, we've found good dentists, right? Yep. And so anyway, I'm grateful that there are good dentists. And I don't really mean that they are sadistic and that that's why they go into it. But they do have to be a bit inured to other people's pain in order to do some of the things that they do.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Gosh, as usual, we're taking way too much time on these early questions. Okay, these next 4 are all COVID, and I think we've basically already talked about them elsewhere. So if you want to add something brief, you can. But question 4, you mentioned needing more time to validate mRNA vaccine safety. What timescales do you have in mind regarding short-term versus long-term effects? Also, can you speculate on what kinds of mechanisms or compounds in the vaccine would yield a long-term safety issue that doesn't manifest in the short term first? It seems like beyond a certain time horizon, the remaining issues wouldn't be from the vaccine per se, but from your own immune system, since that's all that's left behind. So we talked about this in episode 58, which aired on December 12th. We also talked about it in a Q&A, not a private one. I don't have notes on where all of those questions come up in an easily searchable way.
Can I add one thing that I didn't say? First of all, you're right. There's not enough material in the thing, given that the stuff is not outright toxic to begin with. It's not the vaccine lingering in your system that is the concern. Yep. It's the way it interacts with not just your immune system, but also the cells that it invades, right? So there's a question about how good are we at targeting this thing? We dump it into your system. It finds a bunch of cells that have the right receptor, and it invades them and tricks them into creating spike protein, okay? How many cells are destroyed in that process? Which cells are they? What are they involved in, and what does it dysregulate? These are the kinds of questions that you have. What part is novel? The nanoparticles, the lipid nanoparticles are novel. Now, how novel are they? Novel enough to matter? I don't know. But the point is, it's novel. And how long would you need to find out? Unfortunately, the answer is decades. And that doesn't mean you can't ever release a vaccine that you don't have decades of data. But the point is, this is an unprecedented level of coverage. How many people we're trying to vaccinate, and an unprecedented speed with less safety testing than any previous example. The pressure here to get the vaccine into people is so high that basically we've decided, okay, humanity is a guinea pig. And humanity as a guinea pig is not something you ever want to have to do. And it may be something that we have to do, but we should at least be honest about it.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't think it's the same person. Why could the mRNA create more unintended consequences than DNA, though? So that is not what we are arguing.
Yeah, I don't believe that it will.
Right, but that the the delivery mechanism of the RNA vaccines, as we talk about in episode 58, is with these nanoparticles, lipid nanoparticles, and the delivery mechanism for the DNA vaccines is through an attenuated, I think, adenovirus. Maybe it's not attenuated.
It's not really attenuated because basically...
But anyway, it's a virus that we have a lot of experience with.
Borrowed the virus as a vehicle.
Right.
But it is a virus that we have experience with,
Interested in your views of using ivermectin to treat and or prevent COVID. And we discussed this in episode 61. on January 2nd of this year, and we also said a tiny bit about it yesterday, but in yesterday's live stream. But we specifically talked about this, including some peer review. I think, if memory serves, in episode 61.
The doctor who became famous on YouTube for advocating.
Is it Pierre Corey?
I believe it is Pierre Corey.
Yeah, that's who's mentioned in this question.
Put out a paper that covers how it was being used in a medical context, which includes dosage information and when it was being administered relative to infection. So we are not recommending that you do this. We can't recommend it, but it is something that we would probably do. In fact, I would say for myself, I would certainly do if I found that I had come down with COVID.
Yep. What are your thoughts on, so again, we're just going through COVID questions that we've already addressed elsewhere. What are your thoughts on viral immune escape as a result of mass vaccinations? This is from our friend Edith, which I thanked her for directly, but in case you're watching this and didn't see that, we also talked about it in episode 72, not yesterday, but 8 days ago on March 20th. And that was the Dutch researchers, Geert van den Bosche, maybe? I'm sure I'm butchering that and probably don't even have the name right, but that is a response to the stuff that he's putting out there into the world. And then, thanks in part to your dogged determination, the lab leak hypothesis was really gaining steam, and then that bogus WHO investigation into the Wuhan Institute of Virology happened, followed by a bunch of lazy reporting and misleading headlines incorrectly stating the hypothesis was debunked, when in fact it clearly wasn't. How are you feeling about the conversation now? Is it doomed to be buried for all of eternity? And so obviously we talked about this in light of the former CDC director coming out saying it's his opinion that it came from a lab in yesterday's live stream, episode 73.
I will just add, I believe we pay attention on the wrong time scale. And that it is if you try to figure out whether you're making progress and you say, well, we said this, and then a week later this piece came out, it seems like we're making negative progress. If you track over 6 months or a year, we're making great progress. And so I think we have successfully forced the lab leak hypothesis into the mainstream, and that having been lodged there, we have a much better chance of finding out that it's true. And in fact, even CNN just experimenting with what would it be like to admit this is a major indication of progress.
It's huge, yeah. Okay, next question. The women on my mother's side of the family, so now we're into we're out of COVID. We're out of COVID. Thank God.
Short COVID.
About time. Yes. The women on my mother's side of the family have either lived very long and healthy lives or died relatively young from cancer.
I could have predicted the end of that sentence.
I know. Is it possible that the same overreactive repair mechanism that makes them more prone to developing cancer could, ironically, also lead to extreme longevity in the absence of developing cancer?
Yeah, there's no irony here. You've detected exactly the right thing, which is that if you have a lot of repair capacity in your tissues, then you have a much greater chance of getting cancer in those tissues. And somewhere we described this in one of our live stream discussions, and I certainly have talked about it in a couple of places, but the hard to intuit thing is that the example I use is if you have a mother and a daughter who are genetically very similar, lying on the same beach, getting the same DNA damage that triggers a cell to start growing without regulation. That cell will grow into a patch of cells, a round patch of cells, a mole. And that mole will be two different sizes based on their age, right? The daughter will have a much larger mole because she has a lot more of her repair capacity ahead of her. And the mother's mole will be smaller because she has used up a bunch of her repair capacity in living. And what that means is that, both of them stop. Neither of them will turn into a tumor unless they get a second mutation that activates telomerase. The point is, though, the daughter has a much larger likelihood of getting a second mutation in one of those cells because she has a lot more of them. It's like you've bought 1,000 lottery tickets versus 100,000 lottery tickets, right? If you've got 100,000 lottery tickets, the likelihood that one of them is actually special is much higher. So anyway, this is the basic comparison between young and old who are otherwise genetically similar. But now let's take two people of the same age, one of whom has a lot more repair capacity because they're genetically endowed with it, or because they're genetically endowed with small stature, right? So a person of small stature who has the same genetic background as somebody who ended up of large stature, that person will have burned up less of their cellular reproductive capacity in growing, so they will have it left over for repair. So in some sense, they will be younger, longer physiologically, but they will be at greater risk for tumors. And if you were paying attention in 2 live streams ago, you will have heard us talk about the fact that the famous pattern where, all else being equal, larger animals tend to be longer lived than shorter animals. But if you look inside of a species, the pattern exactly flips. This is the reason. If you take something like dogs and you breed them into a bunch of different sizes from some ancestral wolf size, what you get is the smaller ones inherit a repair capacity that's much greater because they don't use so much of it in growth. And so small dogs live longer but are more prone to cancer.
That's awesome. Do you not think then that there is also something else going on with regard to longevity differences between the sexes?
Well, the way I think about this is some fraction of the longevity difference between the sexes will be dimorphism based, and then there, I
Size
believe,
dimorphism based.
size dimorphism
Yep.
based, and some fraction of it. So there will be 3 categories. There will be size dimorphism based.
Yep.
Men tend to be bigger, therefore they will tend to be shorter lived because they will burn up some repair capacity. Now the system is
Easy enough to test whether or not that's fully explanatory.
right, and I don't think it will be.
Right.
I will point out that evolution, because it can adjust the amount of reproductive capacity in your cells tissue by tissue, it can also adjust it. If it turns out you're male, it can adjust it one way. So this pattern doesn't have to exist. Right. So selection can control for this if it wants to, or it cannot control for it. But one thing that is likely to be partially explanatory, size difference between males and females. Then there's what I would call the hold my beer effect, right? The men are more likely to engage in behavior that results in damage that burns up that capacity.
Live fast, die young is a strategy that's more amenable to male beings than female beings.
If you're going to impress the women in order to reproduce, you're going to be taking a certain amount of bodily risk, which is going to burn up some repair capacity.
That's category 2.
That's category 2. And then category 3 is going to be the, actually, it's almost related to that, which is because the hazards and opportunities experienced by men tend to concentrate fitness earlier in life, the selection to maintain the body later in life is lower. So the fragility of males has an independent basis in the evolutionary dynamics. And the question is, so we've talked about species in which the typical dimorphism, or what we see as typical dimorphism, is reversed. Species that compete in 3 dimensions, males tend to be smaller to be more agile rather than larger to brutalize each other, right? So in those cases, are males longer lived? My guess would be probably not, because of the other 2 factors.
So I lost track there for a minute because I was looking at the chat, and someone said, smaller tortoises don't live longer than larger ones, which brings up the issue that what you've said about size, adult size, is going to be most true in species with determinate growth.
Yes.
In which and so that's mammals and birds basically, and insects. But within vertebrates, you've got mammals and birds that have determinate growth, which achieve a size at adulthood that they do not change. Your long bones and your skeleton do not continue to grow. Once you've achieved adulthood, you can get fatter, you can grow out, but you can't grow bigger at the skeletal level. Whereas all the rest of the reptiles, that is to say the non-avian reptiles, including tortoises and non-tetrapod fishes, have indeterminate growth in which, while growth rate slows remarkably, they continue to grow. And so I do wonder then how species with indeterminate growth fit into this rubric of within species, smaller is going to
curiouser and curiouser. Yeah, so there's a bunch of different threads to go, and we could go for weeks,
of course,
on this tangent. But this turtle, in particular, turtles are known to be exceptional with respect to their senescence pattern. That partly
so tortoises is just tortoises is a clade within turtles. Yeah.
Partially, this is the result of work done on the Michigan Biological Reserve by somebody we know, and I'm now forgetting who it was. Somebody we barely knew when we were in Michigan. But in any case,
a grad student who we barely overlapped with, something. Anyway.
I can't remember. I think he might have been a postdoc. But
I don't know the work yet. So
but anyway, the point is this. Think about if you were watching Livestream 72, I think we talked about the fact of the amount of extrinsic danger in the world causing a change in the senescence pattern. The riskier your world, the less likely you are to live to an old age, even if you didn't grow feeble, right? If you're a mouse and let's say that you were a mouse that was capable of living 1,000 years, you still probably wouldn't live 5 years because there are so many predators in the world and you don't have a good way of getting away from them. Yep. So selection doesn't care in some sense about really late life effects on mice because no mouse could conceivably reach them. So in the case of a turtle, which is an animal without determinate growth, with indeterminate growth, the animal actually ages out of predation. Imagine that there is a set of predators. Imagine you had every predator in an environment lined up.
Turtle's a weird example here because turtles are
particularly vulnerable in the first place.
Built predator resistant.
Right. Yeah. But imagine you had every predator in an environment lined up from smallest to largest, right? And then you had them all open their mouth and go, ah, right? And the answer is, okay, at any stage, how many of those mouths can this turtle fit into, right? The smallest ones can fit into every mouth on the list. And the point is, as the animal gets bigger, the number of animals that can eat it gets smaller, which means that if it lives to a certain age, the likelihood of it living to the next stage is greater rather than less.
So that's awesome, but I would like to know if this holds true for, say, mackerel. Right. So like for tuna, I know, not for tuna, for turtles, I know I know broadly speaking the demography, and it's just what you described, right? Yep. Like you have a very high chance of not surviving from 0 to 1. And then if you get to 1 and, 1 might be a year, it might I don't know exactly what 1 is, but like if you're a sea turtle, it's like, having been out at sea for 6 months or something.
Sea turtle, if you live for 3 minutes after escaping the nest.
Certainly, there's actually probably two steps in the demography of a sea turtle, but if you get to some age, it's pretty early on. You're really likely to not make it past that scale.
You're likely not to get off the beach.
But then if you get to there, whatever that might be, you are really likely to get to like 80, 90, 100, something like that. Yeah. And so, whereas, human demographic chart is like high risk of death, high risk of death in the first 3 months in utero, and then, somewhat high as a neonate. And as a child, then it goes down past age 5 or so, and, it's pretty low, and then it starts to climb again, I don't know, in your 40s or something.
Yeah, and then it skyrockets, and then there's a weird thing.
But that it goes down and then it climbs again in your 40s is very different from what we see for, say, turtles. What I don't know is if other things without the turtle anti-predation device, the carapace, the plastron, right, that also have indeterminate growth, also have that that crazy demographic thing where like you just have to get past this stage and then you're really likely to live almost forever.
Right. And then welcome to complex systems. Now imagine that we did that experiment where we lined up all of the predators in the environment, but we did it for, let's say, the Pacific, right? Mm-hmm. Now the range of predators is a whole different ball game because of the buoyancy that is experienced by these animals in the water. In other words, there's lots of animals that can live in the water that couldn't live on land.
Mm-hmm.
And so the answer is there's some very large sharks out there. So you never completely age out of the ability to be preyed upon in the ocean, right? I mean, even, sperm whales get preyed upon by giant squid. But so you get that interesting puzzle. And then you've got another puzzle that has to do with, okay, as you get bigger, depending upon what kind of animal you are, your fuel requirements go up, right? Now, for an endotherm, like a mammal or a bird, these things can be critical. For an ectotherm, right, like a mackerel, it's a different ballgame because effectively they're not burning all these calories to keep warm.
Right.
Although tuna are an exception in this regard.
And determinate growth and endothermy are almost completely a completely perfect match. We don't know. Yes. We don't know with regard to dinosaurs. So we got like this. This I could talk about for a very long time. But right, so we've got a number of things that are convergent between mammals and birds, or maybe it's mammals and archosaurs. Archosaurs being birds plus dinos plus crocodilians. So we got endothermy. Crocs aren't endothermic, and we of course don't know about dinosaurs, but birds are and mammals are. We've got four-chambered heart. Mammals have four-chambered hearts. Birds have four-chambered hearts. Dinosaurs, we can't tell. Crocodiles have an intermediate. They've got like almost, I think, if memory serves, they may actually have the four-chamber, but I think they may have like a 3.5-chambered heart. So they've got like an imperfect separation between, I don't even remember if it's the atria or the ventricles. Endothermy. Did I already say that one? So endothermy, four-chambered heart. I'm forgetting all of the things that we were just talking. Oh, determinate growth. Crocodiles do have indeterminate growth, but do dinosaurs? I don't know. So birds and dinos are each other's are sister taxa. Did at least maybe, is it the theropod dinosaurs, or is it, I think it's theropods that birds came from? I may have that wrong. No, I think they've got that wrong. Whatever dinosaurs birds came from may have had determinate growth, and the rest of them indeterminate. Yeah, and then there's a whole,
right. There's a whole
other set of things. I don't have time to look in. Like I didn't prepare with my chart of synapomorphies, which I can spend way too much time talking about, geeking out on the similarities.
Here we are geeking out on the biology. They tuned in for us to rail against critical race theory, but
yeah. Okay. Next time you're riffing, I may look at my spreadsheet of synapomorphies that I used to do.
To riff at them rather than at you.
Yeah. Okay. If you have an endangered species with one remaining male and one remaining female, what type of genetic traits would you expect to see in 5, 10, or 50 generations? So I included this in our Evo list because I think it's just fairly easy to say you can't do it that way, right? Like you don't know enough based on what the premise of the question is to say what traits will remain.
Well, we can say a few things.
But you can't be precise in any way about what those traits will be.
No, but I can say some things. So I'm going to answer the question you meant to ask rather than the question that you did ask, or I'm going to infer that the question is the one that I think you should have asked, which maybe you did. But so we have seen quite a number, actually, of recoveries from near extinction. Right? When a creature goes nearly extinct and modern bleeding heart liberals like us get wind that sea otters are about to go extinct in the Pacific, or elephant seals, right? These are cases where creatures have been driven to very low levels and then come back. Cheetahs we now see as bottlenecked and dwindling. Anyway, the point is, if you think about it, a population that gets bottlenecked has a problem with incest. But what we never say, so we all understand that incest is genetically dangerous. The reason is because we all harbor small numbers of lethal recessive genes that have no impact on us because we have one copy and not two. But if you mate with your sister, for example, she's very likely to have the same rare recessives that you do, and therefore the baby is very likely to have a pair of dangerous recessives and either be non-viable or stillborn or whatever. So the fact, though, is why do we have all of these recessives that are lethal and lurk in our genomes? Because selection can't see them. If they have no consequence, because you need 2 of them before there is a consequence, then selection doesn't regard them as negative when they're so rare that they almost never encounter a match, right? So we harbor lots of these things when we have a big population. A bottlenecked population, selection suddenly can see all these things and it eliminates them. So the point is, how bad is incest? Less and less bad the more bottlenecked your population has been. So one thing that we expect to see is that populations in which there has been a bottleneck, you describe an extreme one down to 2 individuals, will be populations in which deleterious recessives drop to an extremely low level extremely quickly. So anyway, that's at least one consequence you would expect.
Absolutely. Very good. Another question, excuse me, that I think we can dispatch with pretty quickly. One thing I've never understood about evolution is that I think it assumes a reproductive system, but reproductive systems are complex and sexual reproduction requires corresponding complementary structures in other organisms. What's the evolutionary explanation for the emergence of reproduction? So this could be, everything.
I'm not sure I caught it. There was a pickup line. The second to last sentence in that was the worst pickup line ever, and I lost track of what the actual intent of the question was.
the pickup line being sexual reproduction requires corresponding complementary structures in other organisms.
Right. Just put a "hey baby" on the front of that, and it's the worst pickup line in history.
Hey baby, I've got the corresponding complementary structures to yours.
That's better.
Yeah. I could do that because women don't really employ pickup lines much.
They don't.
Yeah.
They don't need them.
Don't need to.
Yeah.
No. Does evolution require a reproductive system?
What do you mean reproductive system, or what do they mean?
I think the answer is basically no. So it then moves to, but reproductive systems are complex. So obviously things don't start out complex. And to begin with, you have asexual reproduction. And asexual reproduction requires no corresponding complementary structures in other organisms. And basically, evolution through natural selection still happens through mutation and variable survival depending on the environment, and you'll have whole clonal mats of things disappearing because the environment changed, and those things that were fine 3 generations ago but it was identical genetics are no longer fine now in the environment because the environment's changed. And this is one of the main problems with asexual reproduction, right?
So the question is about sexual reproduction?
I read you the question.
I know,
but you know as much.
You seem to understand what the question is.
No, I think it just assumes reproductive system. Like that's what it says.
But is cell division a reproductive system?
I don't know, Bret.
Okay.
I think you're making this far too complicated. I think that no, evolution does not assume a reproductive system. Evolution assumes replication, and it assumes reproduction of sorts, but that can be clonal reproduction, right?
Yep.
So that's it. I feel like you could add something, but you're like deer in the headlights here.
I don't know. I don't know why this is causing consternation. It seems to me that the answer to the question is it doesn't require a complex reproductive system. It absolutely, by definition, requires something that we could call reproduction, which even cellular reproduction is an advanced version of it, and presumably there was a simple precursor.
Each one of these things is a jump in complexity. But you don't. In order for life to begin to exist, you don't need to have complex reproductive system, right? Like there are many steps on the way there.
Yep.
And asexual reproduction existed for 1 billion years at least before sexual reproduction came along. And I think I'm way underestimating that, but that's a number I know is conservative here.
Yep.
I think that we think that sexual reproduction shows up about 1.2 billion years ago first. And the number that I've been saying with regard to in our lineage for sure uninterrupted 500 million years ago, because vertebrates, probably it's uninterrupted in our lineage for 1.2 billion years, but we've had life on Earth for 3.5 billion years-ish, something like that. So 2.3 billion years-ish of asexual reproduction before we ever had sexual reproduction. I think those numbers are right. Next question. Assuming life exists elsewhere in the universe, would it be possible for 2 highly advanced species to co-evolve together to form a symbiotic relationship? This is the premise of The Sparrow, a fascinating sci-fi book I read years ago. It's an intriguing idea, but I think a highly unlikely scenario given our own planet's evolutionary history with a cognitively advanced species.
I can't think of a single bar to 2 species at any distance from each other from establishing a mutualism.
100%. And frankly, if we can't figure this out, it's going to be how we end. Right. If we have to figure it out between us, all humans, and then reach across that gap to other species. And wouldn't it be delightful if it became possible to do so across, totally differently evolved life forms?
Sure. And I will point out that also, to the extent that we are sooner or later going to create artificial intelligence of some type that deserves that moniker, it damn well better be a mutualism.
Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, it's disappeared off the top of the chat, so I can't see it at the moment.
Scroll it, assuming I can get the cursor back.
We should employ the deputy producer who may have ingested a zip tie by now. Yeah. So stop. I lost it again. Stop. I was just responding to the I've got the complementary structures line.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if anyone uses it, let
in
us know if it
some
works.
ways, that's the code running under every single pickup line ever in any species.
Yeah.
Right? That's pretty much what they're all saying.
Yeah, and then when you've got the simultaneous hermaphrodites, like the banana slugs, it gets really messy. Like, I've got the complementary structures, I've got the same structures you've got. Which part do you want to play?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I see it.
Do you think that plant medicines have a role to play in the emerging spiritual chaos of modern society? Could ayahuasca or mushrooms bring about a sense of community across distantly related populations?
Yeah, 100%. And in fact, this is one of many reasons that one should not treat these things as recreational. In some sense, one can take the opportunity of ayahuasca or any other one of these entheogens that has been resident in some culture or many cultures for thousands of years potentially, as the opportunity to look through their eyes. And that it should be treated as an honor. It should be treated as a sacred visit. One should go there. There's something awful about tourists, and I don't see anything different about psychonauts. That there's something to be said about just being deliberate and careful in how you engage these things, because it's the right way to approach them from the point of view of their role in other people's culture, but it is also the best way to recover from them the maximum value.
So I often feel like I don't know what you mean when you say don't do these things recreationally. I just don't, it's not clear to me what you mean. Well, I feel like you just did by analogy. And so if I can complete your analogy, it's traveler is to tourist as, and we don't have the language for the equivalent over in psychoactive psychedelic drug use space, but sort of a deep dive, perhaps using the cultural traditions of the people who have used these things in the past, is to, recreational use, whatever that might look like, as travelers as to tourists in geographical space.
I think that's right, but I would like to be succinct about what I mean, just so we dial it in.
Mm-hmm.
The experience, recreation, is about the somatic experience, right? That was fun. That was awesome, right? My point is, fun and awesome are real, but they are proxies for value, right? We have been built with all sorts of ways that we can experience pleasure, and those things are supposed to be connected to value. And when you unhook value from pleasure, what you get, and technologically, we are in a great position to unhook these two things. So, for example, chemically, if you decide, hey, you know what? Pleasure is awesome. And you know what else is awesome? Feeling great. I'm going to take a bunch of cocaine. And the answer is that's not good for you to trigger that thing without something valuable connected to it.
So to me, that takes me back to not understanding why you say it the way you do then, because I feel like what you've just described is an argument against recreation for its own sake. It's an argument against hedonism. Whereas what you're saying is we have been imbued with the ability to detect things, some of which are good for us, some of which in a modern environment prove not to be good for us, especially because they can be dissociated from the things that are good for us. But that if we bear in mind that these are indeed the things that have been made pleasurable so that we can experience the things that may feel like work, don't separate them. And so, when you say, it feels good, like, well, yeah, we all like to feel good. That's just, that's ipso facto. Yeah, it's a tautology. So I think for some people anyway, including for me, if I didn't know you as well as I did, saying don't do them recreationally sounds a little indecipherable and a little schoolmarmy. And I think what you mean is recreation without an understanding of or recreation in which you have attempted to get rid of the value is not something you should be pursuing.
Well, I want to be, first of all, I don't really.
And so Nick says it should be treated as more than just entertainment, and that's related to what I'm saying.
Well, no, my point, and the reason that I say it in this way, and look, I've been accused of being a prude, wrongly.
I know,
right? I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to them.
Yeah.
I've been accused of being a prude wrongly because this argument, obviously sex can be abstracted from things of value. And my point is the malignant version is called recreation. The idea that there is a category called recreation is the problem.
So, but I think that's exactly consistent with what I said, that you are objecting to the category of recreation. And so when you say you shouldn't do these drugs recreationally, it sounds like you are saying there's other things you can do recreationally and not these. So that's the read that I get and that I think some people will get. Whereas if you specify this category called recreation is actually a problem, that's a modern toxicity.
So then the problem, the reason I agree with you that this is the confusion.
Yeah.
I am against recreation as a category of its own. That is the malignant version of something very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
The danger, right?
Psychedelic prude.
I am a psychedelic prude, I guess. But
no, just like you're not a sexual prude. Like you're not. I don't want you owning that word.
Okay, I agree. My point is that accusation it's a pre-trans fallacy. If I'm accused, and I know that the person saying this is not accusing me of anything, but if you're accusing me of that, then you're in the pre-stage. You have not yet understood what it is I'm trying to say.
Yeah, right.
But let's say that and this is coming, let's say that we had a computer program that could write songs, including lyrics, that would be just so good to listen to. Right? That you would just sing along and they'd be wonderful, but they were written by a computer that had never lived a moment, didn't know a goddamn thing about what it was to be a human being or to fall in love or anything else. It was designed around what would trigger you rather than what's actually meaningful. Right? I would say, I don't care how good that fucking thing feels. Don't listen to it. Right? That's the siren song that is going to destroy your mind.
Yeah.
If you want to.
But I mean, but there's a slippery slope too. Like that may be clearly behind, or at the bottom of the slide. I don't know which way the metaphor goes. But, boy bands that are constructs of some people in an office somewhere, and they went out looking for pretty boys who may not even be able to play instruments. But even, gosh, I'm going to offend people and I'm not going to know it because I don't know. I don't keep track of the name, but is it Beck who's like universally, like songs are always sing-alongable, but a lot of people are like, but it's just not deep enough to really respect.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have this concern about Beck where I feel like he's a Pied Piper of sorts, but the songs are very, very compelling. But anyway, there is something clearly organic with Beck, and the question is, should you be listening to his advice about life or not? But there are obviously lots of boy bands that are designed to titillate rather than to be meaningful. And, how harmful is it to watch this K-pop stuff? It's kind of entertaining, but
I've never seen it. I don't know that it's entertaining, but
it's a lot of attractive young people doing amazing, flashy dance stuff. It's very sexualized, but the point is, it's obviously the choreography and musical equivalent of junk food. Yeah. Right.
It's Korean boy band, so it's not just boys.
It is. But anyway, the malignant category is the problem, and you're right. So, should you take vanillin? Should you put vanillin on your tongue? Because vanilla is a cool flavor.
So it's the same thing. It's a reductionist approach. So that is what we should be exploring. Like how is this about anti-reductionism? How is don't engage in recreation. And that is not the same thing as saying do not engage in things which are usually slotted into the recreational category. What it is the same thing as saying vanillin is not the same as vanilla. Do not take the reductionist modern solution when you can have the bigger holistic solution.
Right. And I would say the way to do it, don't pursue happiness, right? Pursue things that result in happiness, right? And they're quite different.
Yeah. Can you scroll? There was something. Can you scroll?
Yeah.
Something that I saw Stop. Can you do it slowly?
Which direction?
Yeah. Well, we're already at the bottom. I want to see what's up at the top. Close. Okay. A little more. Okay. I lost it. Okay. Go back to so we can just see it as it comes up. Oh wait. Yeah. There it was. Sorry. Rod Dreher. A little more. Rod Dreher wrote an interesting article on psychedelics from a Christian perspective, well worth the read. His partial take is don't approach the numinous lightly. That sounds great. He's great. And I'd be very interested to read what he has to say about it. Okay, so can we go back to the bottom so we see it as it comes in? Thank you. All right, let's try to get through some of these a bit more quickly because we're still a ways from trans. Why is a pineapple not a fruit, Bret?
Well, it's because fruit's not a good category. And so let's put it this way. Fruit is two different categories.
Yeah.
And, it's a little bit like fish and fish, right? There's fishy fish, which is what we all mean in common parlance by fish. And then there's fish, which includes all the tetrapods. So fruit can be its behavior in the world. Is it an object that is designed to entice creatures to distribute a seed? Or is it a structure that is homologous? So the problem with the pineapple is that the pineapple is the stem of the plant. It is not the product. Why are you looking at me like I'm talking crazy?
So what was the example you used before fruit?
Fish and fish.
Yeah, so the obvious analogy, like the behavior of a fruit in the world just made me laugh. But fish has two meanings. One of them is a scientific meaning with a technical distinction by which we are fish. And one is a human meaning with regard to how humans use this thing in our diets. The exact analogy for fruit is like fruit is a botanical distinction that is about like the enlarged ovary of a plant that has been fertilized and has surrounded its seeds with something fleshy and appetizing to some species of disperser.
Yep.
And then there's the human, like how do humans use such things in their diets? It's not perfectly analogous to fish because with regard to diet, we don't call things fish that are fish when we're talking about the fish market, for instance. Whereas with fruit, we call lots of things fruits that aren't actually fruits, if they seem to satisfy that same thing of like sweet, maybe tart plant reward. And so there's lots of sweet tart plant reward out there that we call fruit, but that's not, like rhubarb, like pineapple. And there's things that are actually fruits because they are the fleshy surround of seeds in the enlarged ovary of a plant that aren't as sweet or tart, that exactly like tomatoes that we don't think of as fruit in this like human dietary meaning, but they are botanically fruit.
So I may have to take this back on pineapple. I'm looking at how pineapples flower and I want to figure out how exactly pineapple ecology works. But the general point,
I think it's a stem. I mean, pineapple's a bromeliad.
Yeah, but so anyway, we will come back to pineapples.
Yeah, that's weird.
Remain agnostic on pineapples.
He's just showing a picture of a very strange looking pineapple
First
growing
of all,
that we can't share with you because our producer's gone.
I do not understand why it is that people are all thrown.
So this was supposed to be a short question. Go on, but
everybody goes through. Did you know tomato is a fruit? Tomato's a fruit. This one's obvious. Okay, it's not a hold on.
But it doesn't taste like a fruit.
Right, but why? If you're gonna give somebody a fact, right? Tomato is a fruit is the shallow end of the pool. Cucumber is a fruit.
Yeah. Okay, but here maybe this is part of the reason that people are thrown by tomato and cucumber as well. No one talks about No one talks about cucumbers.
Nobody talks about the fruitiness of cucumber.
This is what we need to be talking about.
It is.
Next live stream, instead of what we have planned, which is going to be totally different from what we've done in the past, all cucumber all the time.
The cucumber cover up.
So I think part of the problem is that fruit is this real botanical term that also has this meaning over in culinary space, whereas vegetable is not a real botanical term. There is no vegetable that means anything scientifically. And so vegetable is this like, is it plant matter that you eat but it's not a fruit? right? It's like this. It's a dietary thing that is already a junk category, and because it has there is no meaning. Like, you call leaves vegetables, spinach is a vegetable. You call fruits vegetables, tomatoes and cucumbers are vegetables. You call tubers and roots vegetables, potatoes and sweet potatoes and carrots, and I'm sure there's lots more. But there's all these things that have meaning botanically to a plant, and we just lump them all into, well, there's fruit if it's kind of sweet, and there's veg if it's kind of not, and that's the category of plant material that we eat. Like, plant's a real term botanically, and fruit is a real term botanically. Avocado is a fruit.
Yep.
And then vegetable is just everything else.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree. Vegetable is either the entire category, including fruit,
right,
or it is all culinary plant parts that aren't fruits or flowers.
Yeah. And Sarah says weeds also don't exist. Yeah. Weeds is that's a plant that's not growing where I want it to grow.
Yep.
Or that I don't want to grow. So I call it a weed. That weed is a human construct.
Weed is a human construct.
Yeah. As is vegetable. Okay. These next three questions
Is the kiwi a bird or a fruit or both?
It's a fruity bird.
That's tough.
Yeah. Or a person.
Yeah.
We've known some kiwis.
I think with kiwis, the males are birds and the females are fruits.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually.
Yeah, because I've definitely seen kiwis that look like birds. I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up too.
Yeah, you would want to look that up.
Yeah.
Would recommend against cucumber cover-up merch. Thank you. Thank you for that. You saved us on that one. I'm going to read the first one of these first. I want us to talk about it a little bit, but then there's two more that kind of relate. Can non-human animals be introverted? Not fearful, timid, or cautious, but as an innate characteristic? Or is introversion uniquely human? The answer to this is 100% yes. And in fact, there has been some personality research on, usually on social animals, but differences exist. And, I think there's even been some research on like birth order effects. But certainly environmental effects with regard to cautiousness versus, appearing to be more inward focused versus externally focused. The next question, the next was just a comment in response to that. Maybe what we call extroversion, introversion in humans corresponds to dominance, submission in other animals. I would say absolutely not. It's a totally different thing. That dominance hierarchies are real. Typically the two different sexes have different dominance hierarchies in probably every, but I'm just going to hedge and say almost every social species. And that being dominant may require, in order to maintain dominance, some amount of public facing display. But that is not a match for what kind of personality you have. And then what jobs would you recommend to an introverted college student trying to pay tuition? So all of this. Would you agree with me about the first question? Can non-human animals be introverted?
Yeah. Well, there will be a spectrum and there is variation. Yeah. So whether you would call one actually introverted, I don't know.
Yeah.
I do think that there is a way in which modern human life greatly increases the likelihood of introversion. In other words, you would be forced to more interaction than you are forced to. And therefore, we have a kind of extreme introversion. And there's also flexibility around it. You can go from being a recluse to integrating yourself into the world. But yes, there is variation within.
Cynthia's gecko is introverted.
How does she know if she only has one?
Well, and this actually, so wouldn't solitary animals qualify? I think I think they would, but how would anyone else know is the answer. Like, there can be introversion and extroversion in a solitary species. On the other hand, being solitary, there cannot be a group dynamic within which wildly different personality types can change what you do, because there's presumably, like, most animals are specialists-ish and they have to go out and do the thing they need to do in the world. And so there's still the possibility of some introversion, extroversion in a solitary species, but I would expect much less so. And then there's the question of how would we, as the scientists trying to study this, know?
Yeah.
But I like the idea. I mean, I think geckos. I feel like I've known pet geckos that were sociable, is how we would tend to describe it, versus reluctant, reticent, hiding under their fake log.
How do you distinguish, for example, between a gecko who is reluctant about social interaction and one who just feels superior to other geckos, like they're not worth its time? But were they to meet another gecko who was, they might be enthusiastic about socializing.
Yeah, that's good. I feel like there's probably a lot of that going on in gecko heads. Geckos have a lot going on.
They do have a lot going on.
I'm curious what kind of gecko you have. I love geckos. Yeah. I want that answer in the chat. What kind of gecko? What jobs you would recommend to an introverted college student trying to pay tuition? I mean, I think that introverts have a responsibility to get over ourselves sufficiently to interact with the world, and most of us are not actually. Most of us aren't dedicated misanthropes or hate social interaction. We just need some time also to sort of reset alone. And so something where your time is alone, your time is your own, or you have the ability to take frequent breaks if you need it frequently, to be alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I might recommend something like Hitman. I mean, in one way it's sort of social, but it doesn't last. It's high
risk. I don't know. In modern times, you wear a mask, or
it's the perfect disguise.
I'm actually a little surprised that we have not seen an uptick in like that kind of burglary, because everyone walks around already masked.
I'm not sure we have it.
I'm not sure we have it either. I mean, I guess business, I don't know. It's ridiculous. We live in ridiculous times. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on creation versus consumption of information? I've watched nearly all the Dark Horse podcasts, and while I find them extremely educational, I can't help but wonder if I should have spent a few more of those 100 hours discovering knowledge on my own through music, craft, writing, hiking, etc. So I am a huge fan of creativity versus consumption. I do think in this case you can do both. There's you probably can't be writing music as you're listening to a podcast, but we've heard from a number of people actually who are doing who are in maker spaces making things as they are listening, and hiking too. I prefer when I'm out in nature to be listening to what's around me, but I know a lot of people will listen to podcasts or music when they're out. So there's depending on what it is that you're making, I think there is certainly the possibility to mix and match.
Yep, but I would also say that there is a tension between, why not just always be productive, right? In some ways, you could make an argument for that. And the answer is you would be less productive if that's what you did, right? So there's something to be said for getting your mind to do something else. There's also something to be said for engaging things that cause your mind to be able to think that which you couldn't have thought before because of the role it plays in your creativity. And so, the admixture is liable to be personal.
Yeah.
But the question really, if we can get right down to it, why are you spending that time listening to the Dark Horse podcast? It could be that you're treating it as entertainment, in which case, don't. It could be that actually you're driven to it. It's rewarding enough for you to do it because it stimulates you to think about stuff that actually causes you to be productive in other ways. Hopefully that is what it is. Hopefully it's that way for everybody who's listening. So anyway, where the sweet spot is very hard to establish, but I have no doubt, just based on my own experience, that lots of stuff that is not formally productive contributes to productivity massively, and that I have said previously that goofing off is serious business. This is kind of what I mean by that.
So follow up to the gecko question. I know because the breeder told me that she or he, so you don't know the sex, that's interesting, was more introverted than his or her siblings. It's a crested gecko. So unfortunately, I never know the common names of lizards because they change so often. So if you did know the Latin name, that would be awesome. And maybe now is not the time to describe to you how to sex a gecko. I won't do it now. I'll save
Well, a
that for the
great
next
pickup line like that is a start.
How do you sex a gecko? Oh no, this one here.
I'm just kidding.
Okay.
The term of art, how to sex something, is a little ambiguous for the uninitiated.
It is. It is. That's why I just
How
said
do
it,
you
and I'm just
sex
going
a
to leave it there.
gecko? You start with a great pickup line.
Oh, I see. Yes. Yes. Okay. Next question. Given that you mentioned the situation with polar bears in your earlier episode, what's your guess on Arctic foxes? Are they just going to get wiped out by competition from their larger red cousins, or could they actually be more adaptable in the environment they live in?
Actually, I know of no reason not to make the same guess with Arctic foxes. Although Arctic foxes, am I right? Arctic foxes have a tawny phase. Are Arctic foxes always white?
Oh, I don't remember. Tell us if you guys know. Also, someone wants to know what the animal at our window was yesterday.
I don't know, but here's the thing. So I began to doubt myself.
So hold on. So we don't know. Tell us if Arctic foxes have a tawny phase. They are a bit different morphologically, more different, I think, from red foxes than polar bears are from.
Yeah, although there's a lot
bears.
of ability for canids to interbreed. So
yeah,
it's a clade in which I would not be surprised to see Arctic fox disappear into.
Yep, they may interbreed. Yep.
Okay, what was out the window? I do not know. However, I did start to doubt myself because I saw the animal. It was large. It disappeared behind the tree and then never emerged. And then I went out there and it wasn't there. And so I thought maybe I saw a reflection. Maybe, Tesla was behind me and I saw the reflection.
Tesla's our black cat
outside. But when I let Maddie out, she immediately went alert. She hunted around and she went right to that spot. And she was not in the room where I described where it was. So anyway, this is an independent data point. She went to that spot and the hair on her back stood up and she barked like crazy and she was sniffing around the base of that tree. So I am certain that there was something, that it was there, and that she knows exactly what it was and will not tell me for some reason.
Furthermore, I insisted that you get on your bike yesterday and go for a bike ride. And you carried a game camera down to the Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge here in Portland and set one up because you were looking for maybe otters or who knows what. But given that we have more game cameras, well, why don't you set one up on that tree?
I'm a gonna.
Okay.
I'm actually reinvigorated on the game camera front. I have not been using them recently, but yeah, I want to find some stuff, and I'd be very curious to know what that animal was because it doesn't really add up. Probably it was a coyote and I saw it as darker than it was, but it really looked like a dark animal. And there aren't that many possibilities here.
Basically, Bret, that animal was literally false, metaphorically true.
Holy moly. No, I don't think that's correct.
Okay. I'm going to read just the first part of this question. It's a long one. My one sentence question would be, where do you both stand on animal rights? Should they be reviewed, extended, enforced more? Do you believe in having a blanket approach or more like a tiered system, domesticated versus wild, pets, sentient animals, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I have a pretty well worked out position on this.
Okay, why don't you do that quickly and then we'll move on rather than me spelling something out as well.
Okay. One, I think there is liable to be, or there should be, a huge distinction between
I'm going to go pee while you
creatures that are liable to be effective robots and creatures that are liable to have analogous pain and consciousness of situations. In other words, I'm very confident that we need to protect the well-being of birds and mammals and many reptiles, maybe all of them. But there's a point at which you get to flies and there's no reason to think that they actually have a subjective experience, and so protecting them may have no meaning in the individual sense. There is an argument to be made for the right of creatures to exist in the world, but it quickly becomes an absurd argument, and I'm particularly dismayed by the idea that has been circulated that we should end all suffering in the universe. And at some point, I can go into why I find this such a distressing idea, but it is among the worst ideas I've ever heard. So what I have come to is that actually, while you can make a strong argument for the right of creatures to exist in the world and to be protected from badness, that is a very difficult process to do well, and you'll never get agreement on it. And that the thing that you can do that produces the same effect is you can agree on humans being the reason that we need to protect creatures, and that among other things, that there is a human need to prevent animal suffering that we create. So anyway, the short answer is, I would say we absolutely have an obligation not to create animal suffering and to protect species from going extinct within reason. There are exceptions, and there may be values that are great enough that we would accept some small level of extinction that would be created by it. But by and large, you can get everywhere you need to go, even if you surrender to the idea that human well-being is the value that must be protected. So in other words, a world in which there are no orcas is a lesser world for people. Therefore, orcas must be protected. Even though I fully believe that orcas are entitled to exist, I don't want to have to defend that, because then what do we do when we get to Anopheles mosquitoes? Aren't they entitled to exist? So anyway, the short answer is, if you make it human-centric, you can protect all of the things that need to be protected, and you can prevent the suffering that we are not entitled to create, for example, in factory farms. And that strikes me as the most effective answer, because people understand it.
All right. The crested gecko is apparently Coralophus ciliatus. I'm looking it up on the reptile database. It's good. It's a beautiful gecko. Used to be Rhacodactylus, which is one of my favorite genera because it's fun to say. Rhacodactylus.
I am totally on board with you continuing to refer to it with that archaic term.
Rhacodactylus. Well, it's okay. I'm not gonna go off on a taxonomy rant here. Okay. Ostriches can grow up to 9 feet tall, weigh over 300 pounds, run more than 40 miles per hour, and have large, dangerous beaks. Isn't my fear of being alone in a room with one rational? I can confidently take an alligator if I have a rubber band. Ostriches are another story. So I think that you're not thinking outside of the box enough, frankly, because if you can pin a crocodile well enough to get a rubber band around its snout, then you can probably pin an ostrich well enough, just knock him down, and then wrap a rubber band around his legs, and you still got to deal with the beak, but once you've rubber banded the crocodile's snout, you still got to deal with the tail. So, both things are still dangerous, but you've really rubber banded the most dangerous parts of them.
You missed the central feature of the question.
Oh, have I?
Yeah, because you've argued the solution is outside the box, and the whole question is predicated on being in a box with an ostrich.
That's true.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think your fear is entirely rational, but I would suggest it may be miscalibrated based on the likelihood of ending up in a room with an ostrich. Were you in such a room, your fear would be absolutely justified.
Even if he has a nice big rubber band and an ability to knock one over?
You don't know what the ostrich has.
I think the assumption here is that both the crocodile and the ostrich is otherwise unarmed.
Unarmed and unlegged?
And unwinged.
Well, then you got a strong shot at defeating.
Then you have a weeble.
It's not a weeble. It'll fall down.
Yeah, probably will. Yeah. Okay, good question.
Mm-hmm.
As a kid growing up in rural Australia, our science lessons included a lot of celebration of the uniqueness of our wildlife, some of it very likely parochial, as the memes comparing our magnificent wedge-tailed eagle with the glorified seagull that is the bald eagle can attest. So I hope that's true. I think it's ridiculous, but if in Australia they're mocking the bald eagle as a glorified seagull, kind of amazing. I was especially fascinated by echidnas and platypuses, platypodes, platypi, pick your preferred plural, and became more so as I got older and read about this early branching from the mammal tree. An expression I love and hope remains scientifically accurate. Yes, it does. Just how do these ancient species manage to last so long, in general and in particular, and is abject weirdness part of it? Or is weirdness as a concept just a failure of intellect, imagination, and experience by us as the categorizers? Love your work so much. Thank you.
Okay, so without having to do all of evolutionary ecology. The short answer. So I have recently realized that two things in the world are the same thing. One of them a biological version of a non-biological something. The two things are what we call living fossils sometimes, and the Lindy effect. So the Lindy effect says that an object that has been around for a long time, we would expect it if it were a biological critter to cease to exist soon, right? The longer it's lived, the shorter it's got left to go.
Right.
Whereas an object, the electric typewriter in the corner over there, has been around a long time and therefore has demonstrated sticking power, right? It has the capacity. It's not an ephemeral object. And so its likelihood of being around another 50 years is actually high. So the point is, why do these things continue to exist? It is a combination of two factors. One factor is this design is really, really good for some niche. Okay, so the point is well designed. Dragonflies are still around because they're a really good design. Okay, so that's one thing. And in the case of something like a platypus, I am certain that there are creatures that you could introduce from elsewhere that would drive them extinct quickly. So it is insulation from superior competitors, right? Australia protects marsupials from placentals in most regards. And good design to begin with that results in the persistence of an ancient clade into modernity. So it's like that. I should say I'm also absolutely fascinated by platypus, and I am determined for us to see them in the wild soon and to spend some time watching them because they're ecologically fascinating creatures, and so preposterous that when the first sample was sent to Europe, it was thought to be a hoax. Did you know that?
I think you've said that to me
I've
before.
said that to you before. Yeah, it was thought to be a hoax. And I don't know, it still may be a hoax, but it's a living hoax out in the wild.
Yeah, it's a very compelling hoax at this point.
It's a very self-perpetuating hoax.
Chop Citizen says, I am normally on the losing end of trying to bathe a cat. I'm a goner with an ostrich. I think that is a response to Al Quinn. Everyone's homework. Go pick a fight with an ostrich and report back if you survive.
But how are we going to know? We're going to get all survival reports.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? The sampling bias problem built into your experimental method here is conspicuous. Yep.
Yeah, true. Okay. Now we have 4 questions related to one another, but not at all the same. Do you believe there is an accurate distinction between sex and the contemporary definition of gender presented by people such as Simone de Beauvoir, John Money, and Judith Butler? If so, what is it? I don't know about John Money, but and I guess I wonder if this question, yes, there's a difference between sex and gender, and we've talked about it many times, and basically we have a slightly, I think it's mostly a semantic difference in terms of how we frame it off the cuff. But for me, gender is the behavioral manifestation of sex.
I say gender is the software of sex.
And sex is hardware, gender is software. And I think, Butler at least is just deeply confused / grifting. I like some combination. I don't know what all her problem is, but she's got a lot of them, I'm pretty sure. So and a long time ago I was forced to read some Butler and I haven't gone back to it, mostly because it's, I think, intentionally indecipherable and then also mutually incompatible when it serves her argument in the moment. So trying to find coherence in that stuff doesn't necessarily make sense. But do sex and gender differ, and is gender a real thing outside of humans? Yes, and we tend to call it sex role. So we've got 3 more questions specifically about trans. The second one I'm going to read is actually from a trans person. But the first one is, you have described people who are true trans as prone to a deep discrepancy between their gendered anatomy, i.e. their biological sex, and their brain's acceptance of that anatomy. You have also said that, quote, gender tracks close to biology in the animal world, but as humans, we can, of course, dispense with outmoded aspects of it. So if gender is real, even to this limited tracking extent, Does that mean that transiting from one gender to the other does indeed make sense? I, the person asking the question, work in a university setting and am trying hard to be a trans ally. I would be relieved to have a confirmation of true trans that I can easily understand and subscribe to, but so far I'm left affronted and mystified by the suggestion that embodied female experience, in all of its gamete-induced reproductive responsibility, is somehow tangential to womanhood. Does this article in Science Daily happen to accord with your own view? Thank you. And then this article that the person asking the question linked to is called, unfortunately we can't show you guys, it's from 2020 in, I guess this is just a summary, this is Science Daily, of some research from the Medical College of Georgia at Augusta University. Gene variants provide insight into brain-body incongruence in transgender. And I quickly skimmed through this article, and yes, I think basically this is exactly central to the argument that there are several manifestations of sex. And, we have primary sexual characteristics and secondary sexual characteristics, and some of them come on board in utero and some of them not until adolescence. And there are also brain manifestations as different from, say, endocrinological manifestations. And there are a variety of reasons that you might have your perceived sense of your sex in your brain be different from what the other systems are telling you, and that this research seems to suggest that there might be, in some cases, some genetic underpinning for that mismatch.
Leaving aside the question of genetic underpinning, what I heard in this question is basically, even so, is there not something about the experience of having grown up female that is not something that one can pick up by making a transition? And I absolutely think that this is certain to be true.
Yep.
And I guess my point would be the correct analogy is expat, right? You can be an expat. You can move to another culture. You can learn its language, and you can integrate yourself into that culture. But it's not the same as having grown up there. Mm-hmm. And my sense is
you're not native.
Right, you're not native. Mm-hmm. And the extent, the thing that is most maddening about the trans ideology claims are that upon transition is complete, covers everything, and to even remember that there was a prior, even the past has been changed by the act of transition, right? They're, dead naming, the idea that dead naming is some kind of
at the individual level, and it's an attempt to erase history. So why should we not be scared that these are some of the same people who will attempt to erase other kinds of history as well?
Right. But but the point is, look, it is possible, and I think the right thing to do, to be compassionate about people who find, for whatever reason, whether it's pathological, which could be the result of environmental influences that are nobody's fault who is suffering this. It is possible to be completely compassionate about the desire to transition, and it is possible to be facilitative of that desire without pretending that anything magical has happened. And, expats, imagine that you move to a country, and the point is, well, I've moved here now. You are to treat me as if we grew up together. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, we didn't.
Yeah.
Right? We didn't. And what's more, if we had, you'd know things about the way we do stuff around here that you don't know. Far better that you are understood to be an expat and welcomed than to be treated as a native.
Yeah. And furthermore, picking up some of the customs that may be traditional, but many of us in modern times have abandoned, does not make you native, and it certainly doesn't make you more this than me, who has abandoned some of the traditional stuff. Right?
Right. Yeah, we could go a lot of places, but I think the basic point is, look, it's expat, and there's nothing disrespectful about recognizing that.
Yeah. So this is just worth saying out loud here. Someone asked, is Butler postmodernist? I had said that I was forced to read her basically back in college. And someone else said, yeah, me too. Read her in the 90s, didn't retain any of it. Someone responds to the question of whether or not she's postmodernist. This is Judith Butler. I think this is right. Her theory is like a combination of Hegelian philosophy, critical theories from the Frankfurt School, and postmodernism, but applied to gender and sex. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
So, love this expat point. I think this is important. Next question. So I am someone who fits the category trans man. I am also rather critical of a bunch of things going on in trans land. In order to try and sort out some of these issues, I've started to divide trans issues into two categories. Issues about how we define things, and issues around what it is people are and are not allowed to do. Is this a reasonable way to try thinking about these issues? So, definitions and actions at some level. And before we try to figure that out, because I wasn't totally sure what I think on first being exposed to that, I will say that I so appreciate, and you're not alone in being a trans person who is uncomfortable with or pushing back against the trans ideology that is taking over. But you're fairly rare, and frankly, we need more of that.
Well, actually,
this is actually, like, we were just talking about this. It's very frustrating to find, and my point to you actually was talking about one particular trans person that we know, who I will not name or in any way identify here. I cannot expect that person to in any way come out against the ideology, which I know they reject, because they are so uncomfortable in the sex that they were born to.
Yep.
That they do not, they pass at this point, and the passing is necessary for them to live as they have chosen to live. And I'm using them just to further obscure, not because I don't absolutely call them by the pronouns that they have switched to from their natal sex. So I would not force that person to go public and say, I don't agree with this, even though I'm certain that they don't. But there are a whole lot of people who are trans, are clearly trans. It's not the most interesting thing about them. But I would wish and I would hope that more of them would stand up and say, this is nonsense. Like, leave us the hell alone and stop doing all of this in our name, because you all are being destructive and don't have anything to do with our experience. So I appreciate the particular nature of the question.
So with respect to the person in question, I would say
the person that we know.
Right.
Yeah.
Would it not be highest on the list of rights that a trans person has to not be trans first? In other words,
yes,
if you manage to transition and pass, then the right not to be calling attention to your transition should be top of the list of things.
Right.
Second, I would say we don't actually know what the distribution of opinion is with respect to trans folks and what they think about trans ideology and trans activism, because the trans activists are so vicious, right? The viciousness of them is designed to punish certain things so that they, they become hidden, like detransitioning and like disbelieving of some of the rhetoric, right? And so we have no idea how alone you are. My guess is you're a lot less alone than you think.
Well, I meant alone, publicly alone.
Right, publicly alone. Yeah. But the distinction that you draw does not, it's possible that in a 3-minute discussion, you would be able to defend that dichotomy and it would be intuitive to us. It's not intuitive.
And once again, it's how we define things and what it is people are not allowed to do.
Right. And so were we in a dialogue, I'd be tempted to push you around and just put things in those two categories that cause the categories not to work. And my guess is I could do it, but maybe not. But what I would say is, as I've been thinking through this, the natural dichotomy that we are looking for is between those things in which some right that we would like to grant comes at the expense of somebody else's right, and those things in which there's no loser. It's like the difference between a victimless crime and a crime that victimizes somebody. And the answer is, anytime somebody else is on the losing end, we at least have to have a discussion about the balance between those things. So granting trans people the right to, enter a sport as the sex they've transitioned into obviously erodes the rights of women in particular, to compete against other women and not men.
A crisis center or a prison.
Right. Whereas I'm perfectly comfortable using pronouns as you define, up to the point that you want to force me to say some pronoun that doesn't exist previously, right?
Yeah.
At the point that you want to take over some piece of my language software and force me to add things to it that I don't believe in and to use them under threat,
Yeah.
no. But to the extent that you say, okay, he, him, I'm fine with that. He, him is fine. She, her is fine. You get to define it, because who's losing in that case? Nobody. So
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the distinction I would draw. Is there somebody losing in your gain of rights, in which case there's at least something that has to be discussed?
That's good.
Or is it without cost to anyone, in which case, as a courtesy, we ought to facilitate people. We ought to, look, if if you don't like loud noises, you may not be able to stop every jackhammer in the city, but we can accommodate you to the extent that we're interacting. We can, not yell or something.
I think there's also an important distinction to be made, which will seem obvious, but I've never thought it in these terms before. Just as it is well understood, and you have talked about this from an evolutionary perspective, although not publicly yet, that homosexuality is a category that is true, and yet male homosexuality and female homosexuality are very different and have different manifestations, different ways that they look, exactly following from male typical behavior and female typical behavior. Exactly analogous to that. Trans men and trans women are really very different phenomena. And this has been talked about a lot of late with the rise of adolescent girls becoming convinced through social pressure that they are in fact boys. But put that aside, that that social contagion thing aside for the moment. Really, a trans man who is writing this is a completely different phenomenon from a trans woman, and in part because the respect and the equal treatment that trans men are hoping for in society come at risk to the trans person mostly, rather than the population that they are entering. Because the population that a trans man is entering is men who are largely going to be stronger and more powerful and all of this. Whereas the population that a trans woman is entering is women who are mostly going to be, less strong and capable of defending themselves should that be necessary. So there is really also disparity within trans of the two types of transness.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of them, you pick up an advantage, a protected class, and the other, you enter a more difficult, with respect to things like sport and defending yourself, category.
Yeah. And frankly, anecdotally, the people I know, and even just the occasional questions that I get where people identify as such, are much more likely from trans people, are much more likely to be trans men than trans women. Okay, one more trans question. We started a little bit late, but one more trans question, and then we'll try to get maybe two more quickly after that. You've spoken about transgender people being treated in accordance with their gender identity in cases where physical sex differences don't justify differential treatment based on sex. Can you give some examples of where differential treatment based on expressed gender identity would be justified? It seems to me that a lot of that would fall under the heading of sexism, and I'm curious as to what I might be missing here.
Oh, that's a very good question. I think the answer is a lot of it is it's a very tough question. My sense is, if we're honest with ourselves, I got it. It is exactly analogous to the question of color blindness, right? Color blindness is the standard to which society must adhere, right? Society has to be colorblind. Your courts have to be colorblind, right? Otherwise, you live in a dystopia. Does that mean that anybody walks in? Does it mean that the judge in a courtroom doesn't recognize that you're black or you're Asian? No. Colorblindness does not mean you turn into a dope who can't see things. It means that the formal structures are indifferent, and then the human interaction is of some other nature, right? Like, do we really expect jurors in a court or the judge or the lawyers to not process, Black American vernacular differently than they process standard school English? No, of course. The point is your brain is...
Or even, recognize race on the phone, right? Like we can hear these things.
Sure. So
Not
the point
always
is,
perfectly, but we can hear these things.
The point is, can you be colorblind, that is to say, formally fair and indifferent to race?
Heard it, don't care.
Right.
Right.
Heard it, or, it's not, I won't even say don't care. Okay. It's like, it doesn't impact your status. It doesn't impact what rights you do and don't have.
So that's what I mean by don't care, but I get the distinction.
Right. Yep. I don't want to say don't care because I think the fact is, right, human beings are wired to recognize the sex of somebody they are talking to. They recognize it, frankly, at 50 meters, sometimes 100 meters, right? What are we picking up on? Doesn't even really matter. The point is, it's a real category, right? Are you 100% right? No. Sometimes you think somebody's female at 100 meters, and at 40 meters, you realize they're male. But the point is, in general, you categorize this bit because it's important.
Yep.
And all I want to say is, nobody thinks, right? When is the last time that you had a conversation with somebody, right? If you report a conversation you had with a clerk at the drugstore, right? You don't remember the content of the conversation and not remember the sex of the person you were talking to. So I guess the point is to treat somebody as the gender that they have transitioned to does not mean that you are making different rules for them.
Right. But, but there will be downstream effects that we don't see now. And so, I think a lot of us are increasingly concerned and kind of putting up a barrier going like, whoa, like, how is it that suddenly you've got an uptick in violent domestic abuse by women? Oh, it's a trans woman. Wait, like you're fucking with the stats now. You're fucking with our understanding of what is actually true. And yes, women can be violent, and all this is true. And I don't want to hear about these exceptional cases at the moment. What I want to talk about is that there are men who retain male typical behavioral patterns who are, often, I would generally, to the extent that I've looked at these cases, would say these are not true trans people. These are cosplaying cross-dressers who have somehow got journalism and maybe even the law to describe them as women, and no, it's actually necessary that we understand as a society some of the really big sex differences with regard to things like violence.
So I have fought this battle previously at the question of the terminology, right? And my point is, this is one of these places where there is a downside, and therefore we have to have a discussion. I would advocate that what you become is a trans woman, right? And that the point is that can have full human
trans
status.
Trans women aren't women.
Right.
Trans women are trans women.
And the point is, what does that mean? Well, it means for things where we're talking about, look, if you present as female and you say your pronouns are female, then I will categorize you as female, but I will not categorize you, female is not a category. Like a girl and a woman are two different things. It's a distinction. And so within that category, we can say trans woman, expat, effectively, right? Versus born female, currently female. And the fact is, you need to have that distinction for exactly the statistical reason you're talking about. Were there a pattern that you needed to figure out, right? And we're talking about autoimmunity having
exactly.
A sex bias.
It's the junkification of real categories
right.
too.
The junkification of real necessary categories that are not your personal choice.
Yeah. Could you scroll back up? I saw something about. You're not scrolling yet. Okay. Hold on. Go a little bit farther, I think. So this is really not working very well. Okay, back down. Oh, there we go. So Chop Citizen is a furry identifying as a Belgian Shepherd who is going to sue the Westminster Kennel Club if they won't let him into the show. I think that's a great idea.
It is an excellent idea. Yeah. I'm very in favor of this, and we support your furriness.
Oh, absolutely.
And wish you luck in the show.
Yeah. Okay. Even though we're at the end here, just two last questions quickly. Again, always great questions, and we won't get through all of them, but we will have gotten through 26 this time. The NBA and college basketball are disproportionately dominated by men with dark skin. Why?
Yeah. Can I just
Do it.
Riff away?
Yeah.
All right. Let's put it this way. The problem, the thing that haunts our entire racial discussion is the fear, the rational, but I believe ultimately incorrect fear, that what we see in athleticism will be mirrored in cognition. In other words, that there are massive racial distinctions in capacity to do things like play basketball or box or any of these things. And the problem is those things, those athletic feats, are basically mirrors of ancestral environments that favored different things. So we've made the case that if you think about marathon running tends to be dominated by Ethiopians and Kenyans, right? I don't know of a single case in which an Inuit has won a major marathon. And I don't expect it ever to happen. Why? There's a very simple reason. People from Ethiopia and Kenya have a heat loss problem, right? They are long and lanky, and they are long and lanky because they need to radiate heat, which requires a large surface to volume ratio. Inuits have the exact inverse problem. They need to retain heat, and so they tend to be round, right? They minimize surface to volume ratio by being rounder. Being round is not a good shape for running a marathon. It's a good shape for other things. So the point is, it's not about a hierarchy of races, right? Races differ because they're adapted to different environments physically. Mm-hmm. There's no reason for this
and
to be...
different games like basketball will mimic to some degree some of those different environments.
Right. Mm-hmm. Now, you could make arguments like this for cognition, but the thing about us, you've heard us say that we are software-based creatures at a level unparalleled in any other species. And the point is that, yes, there are massive distinctions in the way different populations think about different puzzles based on where they came from. But the point is the software is democratizable. And to the extent that you wish to become, if you think about the last time, how compromised is Andrew Yang's English, right? Based on the fact that he is historically ancestrally Asian. Not compromised, right? He picked up the English software and appears to be running it at, really exquisite level. So the point is...
As would everyone. There is no expectation.
There's no barrier. In fact, we know there's no barrier in this case. The language you speak, you can vary in quality, but the basic point is, it's developmental. What were you exposed to when you learned a language? There's no holdover of... Mandarin or whatever, because your ancestors came from China, right? Yeah. The point is it's software. So, the NBA is dominated by black men and dominated by tall black men because...
Right. Not by Indians. And, not because Indians aren't also good at dissipating heat, but there's also something about height.
Right. It might have something to do with where they put the basket.
Well, no, obviously with basketball, I'm talking about, Ethiopians and Kenyans.
Right.
And actually we were talking about marathoning. So awesome marathoners also tend to be tall, I think. But I'm now talking about too many different sports, so it's hard to do this.
And then there's a question about Copper Canyon and Mexico and super ultra long. A marathon is just a warm up for multi-100-mile races and.
Well, let's see. So we're talking about marathoners. This is NBA and college basketball.
But the point is,
ultra marathoners do not. So you raised marathoners.
Yeah,
ultra marathoners actually don't seem to be as racially segregated. The winners, and in fact, this is a whole separate thing.
What do you mean ultramarathon?
People beyond, either
really long races beyond.
A lot long, 50, 100, 200 mile races.
Yeah.
And indeed, interestingly, there is some maybe evidence, although I think it's a little dicey, that at those really long distances, women may actually do as well as men. The idea being that, persistence at just going and going and going, if you already have the ability to go, is you basically lose some of the advantages with regard to strength and sort of, fast twitch muscle fibers that men tend to have more of than women at very long distances.
Okay, so I think we've nailed the question, and the answer is there's a very good reason that different sports select for people from different ancestral populations.
Scroll. Or maybe there's nothing more.
And it has to do with
other way.
different habitats.
Okay, so we weren't seeing. We didn't see the chat for a while there for some reason. You had it. Can we just see what we just missed a ton of stuff because it wasn't scrolling. Can you show me how to scroll?
That's
how
the
do I do
trackpad.
it?
There's a slight delay. I have 2 fingers.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, guys. For some reason it was stalled out, so we didn't see the last like 10 minutes. Okay, but it's now. Is it finally at the bottom? I can't tell if it's at the bottom. Okay. So we're going to answer one more question, and I will keep an eye on. Marathoners aren't particularly tall. I think that's right. And yeah, exactly. Women outperform at ultra races, 200 kilometers plus. I'm not as sure. God, was it like the BBC interviewed me for some like overnight show a couple of years ago about this? And so I did a little research. And I think the numbers are still so tiny of people who do this that might just be outliers. That we're rather like we just don't have enough of a sample size to know if that's a legitimate finding. But there are reasons to think that at very long distances, women the usual advantage that men have in sport disappears.
It's also possible that physically men still have that advantage, but they get distracted over those long distances.
I didn't say distracted, but I did make an argument about they've just are not as interested in participating. It is a kind of distracted, just choosing to do something else already because this is endless.
Yeah.
And you have to believe you can scroll. Yeah. One last question.
That's not going to make a great song. I believe I can scroll.
Yeah, not so much. Let's see. You briefly discussed, the last question, you briefly discussed a different vaccination program that you took your kids through in episode 69, delaying some vaccines. Would you be able to talk more about possible responsible vaccination plan for infants and children, or maybe point us to some scientific or trustworthy research which isn't claiming that vaccinations don't come with any risks? So I hope that some such literature exists, but I don't know of it. If it does, we did it from sort of first principles and having each other to talk about it and agree on every decision that we made about our children. So you want to go?
I mean, all I can say is the rubric is very simple. You want to delay things as long as possible. There's a balance between the likelihood that you'll encounter some sort of pathogen and therefore if you're not going to encounter something until you go into school, then why vaccinate before you get there? If you're not going to encounter something until you're in your late teens, why vaccinate earlier than that? And the later you delay it, the more life that exists after is shorter. Probably.
So the higher likelihood you don't need to get a re-up. I think anything you get in childhood usually needs at least one re-up at onset of adulthood, but a lot of vaccinations you get in adulthood are lifelong. You might have to get your titers checked later, but the longer you delay, the fewer aftershots you may need. The
fewer boosters.
Yeah.
The more chance that the more chance that if something's wrong with the vaccine, it will be discovered and you can be saved from having it. And the more of development, the real key one that drove us was the more of your development is already behind you and therefore not disruptable by the existence of the vaccine. And then there's a question, and I still don't know how to navigate it because I'm not convinced that we have really good information on the long-term costs. But, there's a question about annual vaccinations like for flu, and whether or not it is simply a matter of get your flu shot so you don't get the flu, or whether there's some debt that accumulates over many vaccinations, and it's not a simple puzzle. But no, I think I would say knowing the precise details of what we think we understand is not liable to be useful because what we understand is very incomplete. But the general rubric of delay novelty as late in development as you can is a pretty good guide.
So I have 2 things to add. And I had a delay, but also if you can limit how many you have your child take at a time. And that means it's a pain because it means you go to the doctor more often. And, it's really easy to be like, okay, this is the day I get 4, and then I don't have to come back for however many months or a year. But if you can spread them out, and we didn't concentrate on that for our children as much as on the delay, but increasingly I think that's wise too.
Yeah.
And then, less so for children and babies, children, and young adults, but for most, like I already said, for most adult vaccines, you get it, and then maybe you have to have your titers checked, or maybe they just say like, okay, in 10 years you'll have to have this again. And I would say, if it's time to have your next, whatever it is, tetanus, typhoid, whatever shot it is, see if you can get your titers checked instead of just getting the new vaccine. Because very often these actually provide lifelong immunity. And it would be, a titer check is just a blood draw. They're adding nothing to you. And that is very often likely to reveal that you actually are still immune, and you don't need to take whatever hopefully tiny cost there is from another vaccination. Related, I actually took our Tesla to a holistic vet this week, fed up with our standard vet and their insistence on, just like with standard medical doctors, on their insistence on drugs and knife work for every problem that presents. It's a 10-year-old cat who's doing fine, except he started yowling. We thought maybe he was in pain, and this holistic vet didn't really come up with anything about why he might be yowling, but did say in the paperwork that he gave me, okay, it looks like he's fully vaccinated every year since he was tiny. I'm like, well, yeah, that's what we do. And he said, for humans, we don't do that. Why do we do that for our animals? Instead, you could have their titers checked, and for a couple of these, it's likely that they'll never need another vaccination again, and that's not just cheaper for you, but better for the animal. And this was an important moment for me because I have been thinking about this for our children and for us for decades now. And we've been complaining about veterinary practice and about not being able to find veterinarians who can listen to us as animal behaviorists and engage with what the animals are doing. And yet of course, it's July, it's time to get all the animals revaccinated. I had literally never questioned that. And so, there's still things like this that exist for us too. It's like, oh, of course, great, okay, terrific. Let's do that instead of just knee-jerk revaccinating every year, because that is the schedule that I wonder who came up with. Probably the drug developers.
Right. Drug developers and veterinarians in an environment in which their liability is capped at the value of the animal, and that isn't very high. And so the point is the natural pressure to protect you against needless vaccines is non-existent.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we have come to the end.
To the end. We've answered all the questions.
No, we didn't answer all the questions. We answered all the questions that I read out loud. It's different.
Yeah.
Yeah. We didn't. We had 50 by some counts. Now, you guys should know, you probably have figured out that if you ask 2 questions, I go through and I immediately get rid of one of them, and then I don't privilege you just for having asked 2. So I think if I excluded comments and double questions, I think we had 41, and we only got through 26, but that's good. I had a fun time.
Yeah. It's the end of the stream as we know it, and I feel fine.
I do too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Cool. Well,
so this is going to be on you.
What?
To actually end the stream.
Oh, I'm going to end the stream,
yeah.
Of course. And I'm going to remember the keystrokes that do that. And
with the help of your handy dandy sheet from Zachary. Is there anything else? We love these too. Thanks, Nick. It's fun. And we'll be back next month. Same time, same place.
Same place. Yep. See you all then. And be well. Get outside the whole bit.
Get outside. Yeah.
Hi there. We're still here. Yeah. It's all so